The Sovereign Mind, Becoming Unshakable from the Inside Out. A Mindscape deep dive. Cold open. Hey there, friend. Welcome back to Mindscape. If you were with us for our last deep dive, you already know how this works. We take a book, we sit with it, we pull it apart, and we talk about what it actually means for your Tuesday afternoon, not just your bookshelf. Last time we went through Dr. Marcus Penn's The Art of a Quiet Mind, and so many of you wrote in and said the same thing. Okay, I understand letting go. I understand slowing down. But how do I actually become someone who isn't rattled by every rejection, every comparison, every bad day? How do I build a self that doesn't wobble every time the wind changes? That question is exactly what we're diving into today. We're exploring Dr. Penn's follow-up work, the ideas he calls the sovereign mind. And before you picture some intimidating stoic warrior thing, let me reassure you. Sovereignty here doesn't mean being cold or unfeeling or above it all. It means something much simpler and much harder. It means your sense of who you are doesn't get handed out by other people. It doesn't get decided by your worst day, your last mistake, or the opinion of someone who barely knows you. Grab your coffee, settle in, because this one's a long, slow burn. We've got a lot of ground to cover today, and I want to actually cover it, not rush through it. So let's begin. Part 1, the approval trap. Let me start with a question. When was the last time you made a decision, a real decision, without running it through the filter of what will people think? Take your time. I'll wait. Chances are it's harder to answer than you expected. Because for most of us, that filter is running constantly, silently, in the background of almost everything we do. What we wear, what we post, what we say in meetings, what we don't say in meetings, who we date, who we stay with even when we shouldn't, what career we chase, what career we quietly abandon because someone once raised an eyebrow at it. Dr. Penn opens this book with a claim that sounds simple but is actually kind of devastating once you sit with it. He says most people are not living their lives. They're managing their image of their lives. There's a difference, and that difference is where an enormous amount of our suffering lives. Here's how he describes it. Imagine two people doing the exact same thing. Let's say starting a small business. Person one is asking themselves, does this work fulfill me? Am I building something I believe in? Person two is asking, what will my family think if this fails? What will my old classmates think if I don't succeed as fast as they did? Will people see me as someone who took a risk and won, or someone who took a risk and embarrassed themselves? Same action, completely different internal experience. Person one is anchored to their own values. Person two has outsourced their entire sense of worth to an audience that, honestly, isn't even paying that much attention. And that's the part that stings when you really absorb it. We spend so much energy performing for an audience that is largely imaginary or largely indifferent. Think about the last time you agonized over a text message, rewriting it 4 times so it wouldn't sound needy or cold or weird. And think about how much time the other person actually spent thinking about your message once they read it. A few seconds, probably. Maybe less. We are the main characters of our own anxious dramas, and everyone else is a background extra scrolling past, mostly thinking about themselves. Dr. Penn calls this the approval trap, and he says it operates on a kind of false economy. The trap tells you, if you just get enough approval, you'll finally feel secure. If enough people like you, respect you, admire you, then you can relax. But here's the catch. Approval is not a bank account. It doesn't accumulate. You can get 100 compliments and 1 piece of criticism, and guess which one keeps you up at night? The approval trap is a treadmill, not a destination. You can run on it forever and never actually arrive anywhere, because the moment you get the approval you were chasing, your nervous system doesn't relax. It just raises the bar and starts chasing the next thing. Why does this happen? Dr. Penn walks through the evolutionary piece briefly because I think it actually helps to understand why this feels so intense, so wired in, rather than just a character flaw you should be able to switch off. For most of human history, being disliked by your group wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Exile from the tribe could mean death, so our brains developed an incredibly sensitive alarm system for social rejection. That system doesn't know the difference between being kicked out of a hunting party 3,000 years ago and getting a lukewarm response to a text message today. It fires the same alarm either way. Your palms sweat, your stomach drops, your mind starts spiraling. That's not weakness. That's an ancient survival mechanism misfiring in a modern context it was never designed for. Once you understand that, something shifts. You stop thinking, why am I so pathetic that I care this much what people think? And you start thinking, oh, this is just an old alarm system doing its old job in a world that doesn't need it the same way anymore. That reframe alone takes some of the shame out of the experience. But understanding the mechanism isn't enough on its own. Dr. Penn wants us to actually build a different internal structure, one that doesn't depend on the alarm system to know if we're okay. Let's talk about what he calls the two audiences. Every one of us is, whether we realize it or not, performing for an audience. Most people are performing for what he calls the external audience. That's the composite, imagined jury of everyone whose opinion you've ever cared about. Parents, exes, that one harsh teacher, co-workers, strangers on the internet, people from high school you haven't spoken to in a decade. This external audience is loud, but it's also incoherent. It wants contradictory things. It wants you ambitious but humble, confident but not arrogant, successful but relatable, thin but not vain, generous but not a pushover. You cannot satisfy this audience because it doesn't actually agree with itself. Trying to please it is like trying to solve a puzzle with pieces from 10 different boxes. The alternative is what he calls the internal audience of one. This is you, at your most honest, at the end of your life, looking back. Not the anxious you, not the people-pleasing you, but the steady, wise version of you that actually knows what mattered. Dr. Penn suggests an exercise here that I found genuinely useful. Before a hard decision, instead of asking what will people think, ask, will the wise, older version of me be proud of this choice? Not the version of me trying to look good right now, but the version of me who will actually have to live with the consequences of this decision in 10 years. This single shift in questioning, from what will people think to what will I think when I look back, quietly reroutes your whole decision-making process. It pulls you out of the noisy stadium of public opinion and into a quieter room where only one vote actually counts. Now, I want to address something important here, because I don't want you to hear this and think Dr. Penn is telling you to stop caring what anyone thinks ever, to become some detached island of a person who ignores all feedback. That's not sovereignty. That's just a different kind of imbalance. There's a difference between caring what people think and being ruled by it. You can value someone's perspective, take their feedback seriously, even let it inform how you grow without handing them the keys to your self-worth. A mentor telling you your work needs revision is valuable information. A stranger online telling you you're worthless is noise, dressed up as information. Sovereignty means developing the discernment to tell the difference. Here's a practical distinction Dr. Penn offers. Ask yourself 2 questions about any piece of criticism or judgment you receive. First, does this person actually know me? My full context, my effort, my intentions? Second, do they have my genuine best interest at heart? If the answer to both is yes, it's worth sitting with, even if it stings. If the answer to either is no, you're allowed to let it pass through you like weather, acknowledged but not absorbed. Let's get concrete, because I think this concept can feel a little abstract until you apply it to something real. Let's say you decide to leave a stable, prestigious job to do something less conventional. Maybe you want to become an artist, or start a small farm, or go back to school in your 40s. The moment you announce this, you're going to feel the pull of the approval trap immediately. Family members will have opinions. Old friends will ask pointed questions at dinner. Someone will say, in a tone dripping with concern that's really just judgment wearing a nice outfit, "Are you sure that's a good idea?" The approval trap wants you to make this decision based on minimizing that discomfort. It wants you to stay in the job you hate because at least nobody questions it. Sovereignty asks a different question entirely. It asks, is this choice aligned with what I actually value, and can I live with the natural consequences of it, good or bad? If yes, then the discomfort of other people's opinions is simply a toll you pay for authenticity. It's not evidence that you made the wrong choice. It's evidence that you made a choice that wasn't designed by committee. Dr. Penn tells a story in this section about a woman he worked with, a corporate lawyer who spent 15 years building a career everyone was impressed by. From the outside, she had made it. 6 figures, a title, a corner office. But she described her internal experience as a kind of low hum of dread that never fully went away, because she knew, deep down, that she had built this entire life to satisfy an audience that included her parents' expectations, her college classmates' comparisons, and a version of success she picked up from other people's applause rather than her own compass. When she finally left to pursue restoration work on old furniture, something she'd loved quietly for years, the approval trap screamed at her. Her mother cried, actually cried, at the announcement. Colleagues sent pitying messages disguised as support. But she said something that I think captures the entire spirit of this chapter. She said, "I finally realized I was so afraid of disappointing an audience that was never going to clap for me anyway, no matter what I did, because their approval was never really about me. It was about their own fears playing out through my choices." That's the approval trap in a nutshell. Half the time, the people whose approval we're chasing are not actually evaluating us fairly. They're projecting their own unlived fears, their own regrets, their own limited sense of what's possible onto our choices. Their disapproval often has less to do with you and more to do with what your choice reflects back at them about their own life. So how do we actually build resistance to the approval trap? Dr. Penn offers a few practices. The first is what he calls values excavation. Most of us have never actually sat down and written out, in plain language, what we personally value, separate from what we've absorbed from our culture, our family, our social circle. He recommends an exercise where you write down 10 things you believe make a life well lived, without editing yourself, without worrying about whether they sound impressive. Then he wants you to look at your calendar and your bank statement from the last month, because those 2 documents don't lie. They show you where your time and money actually went, which is the truest evidence of what you actually value in practice, regardless of what you say you value. Often, there's a painful gap between the list and the calendar. That gap is where the approval trap has been quietly running your life. The second practice is disapproval rehearsal. This one sounds strange at first, but stay with me. Dr. Penn suggests deliberately imagining the worst-case social reaction to a choice you're considering in vivid detail before you make it. Not to talk yourself out of it, but to desensitize yourself to the fear. Picture the raised eyebrow. Picture the awkward silence at the family dinner. Picture the unfollow, the whispered comment, the disappointed voicemail. Sit with it fully. And then ask, can I survive this? Almost always, the honest answer is yes. The disapproval, once actually imagined in full color rather than left as a vague, looming dread, turns out to be survivable. It's the vague, unexamined fear of disapproval that has all the power. Once you look directly at it, it shrinks. The third practice is choosing your jury. Dr. Penn suggests identifying a small handful of people, maybe 3 to 5, whose judgment you genuinely trust because they know you deeply and want good things for you. These become your actual jury. When you're tempted to run a decision through the enormous, incoherent tribunal of public opinion, you instead run it through this small, trusted panel instead. This doesn't mean ignoring everyone else's existence. It means being deliberate about whose voice actually gets a vote in your internal parliament, instead of handing a ballot to every random person who happens to have an opinion. I want to pause here and say something that I think is easy to miss in all of this. None of this is about becoming indifferent to people. In fact, it's the opposite. When you're not desperately chasing universal approval, you actually become more capable of real intimacy, because you stop performing and start showing up as you actually are. People can feel the difference between someone who is present with them and someone who is subtly managing an image in front of them. Paradoxically, letting go of the need for everyone's approval often makes you more likable, not less, because authenticity reads as magnetic in a world absolutely saturated with performance. There's a phrase Dr. Penn returns to throughout this section that I want to leave you with before we move on. He says, "The applause of a crowd that doesn't know you is not worth the silence of a life that isn't yours." Read that one twice. Sit with it. Because underneath almost every anxious decision, every dimmed dream, every abandoned passion is some version of this trade. We trade a life that's actually ours for applause from people who, if we're honest, we're never going to remember the moment a week later anyway. Part 2. Boundaries as an act of self-respect. Let's shift now to something that flows directly out of everything we just talked about. Because once you start caring less about universal approval, you run into a very practical problem. You have to actually learn how to say no. And for a lot of us, that word feels almost physically dangerous to say out loud. Dr. Penn opens this section with an observation that I think a lot of people will recognize immediately. He says most people think of boundaries as walls, as something cold, something that pushes other people away. And because of that framing, setting a boundary feels like an act of aggression, almost a betrayal of the relationship. But he wants to completely flip that idea on its head. He argues that a boundary isn't a wall at all. It's a fence with a gate. It's not designed to keep everyone out. It's designed to let you decide consciously and clearly who comes in, how far, and under what conditions. Think about it this way. A house without any walls isn't warm and welcoming. It's just exposed. Everyone can walk in any time, take anything, rearrange the furniture without asking. That's not intimacy. That's chaos wearing the costume of openness. Real intimacy actually requires structure. It requires knowing where the door is, so that when someone is let in, being let in actually means something. Here's where a lot of us get tangled up, though. Many people, especially those who grew up in households where love felt conditional, where you had to earn affection through being agreeable, through being helpful, through never causing friction, develop what Dr. Penn calls boundary guilt. The moment you even think about saying no to something, guilt floods in before the sentence even leaves your mouth. You start pre-negotiating with yourself. Maybe I can do half of what they're asking. Maybe I can say yes, but complain about it internally. Maybe I can say yes and just quietly resent them for the rest of the week. Sound familiar? Dr. Penn wants to be very clear about something here. Boundary guilt is not evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's evidence that you were trained, somewhere along the way, to believe your worth is tied to your usefulness to other people. If you were praised as a child, mostly for being helpful, agreeable, low maintenance, then somewhere deep down a wire got crossed. It started to feel like saying no equals being unloved. That's not true, but the emotional part of your brain doesn't always know the difference between what's true and what was trained. Let's talk about the different flavors of boundaries, because Dr. Penn breaks this into categories that I think are genuinely useful. The first is time boundaries. This is about protecting the finite resource of your hours and your attention. Saying no to a meeting that doesn't need you. Saying no to being available at all hours for a friend who never respects your schedule. Saying no to the family member who calls at 9 p.m. expecting a full hour of emotional labor from you when you're already exhausted. The second is emotional boundaries. This is about not absorbing other people's moods as your own responsibility to fix. If someone is in a bad mood, that doesn't automatically mean it's your job to manage it, soothe it, or take it personally. Dr. Penn tells a story about a man who realized, after years of therapy, that every time his mother was upset about anything, he would drop everything and try to fix her emotional state, even when the thing upsetting her had nothing to do with him. He described it as feeling like her emotional weather was somehow his responsibility to control. Learning to let her have a bad day without making it his job to engineer her happiness was one of the hardest and most freeing things he ever did. The third is material boundaries. This covers your money, your possessions, your physical space. Lending money you can't afford to lend because you're afraid of seeming stingy. Letting people borrow things and never return them because asking for them back feels confrontational. These might seem like small things, but they add up to a persistent low-grade resentment that erodes your relationship with the people around you and with yourself. The fourth is what he calls value boundaries, and this one might be the deepest of all. This is about not compromising your core principles to keep the peace. Staying quiet when something happens that genuinely conflicts with what you believe is right, because speaking up might create tension. Going along with a decision at work that you know is unethical because pushing back feels risky. Over time, repeatedly crossing your own value boundaries doesn't just damage your relationships with others. It damages your relationship with yourself, because on some level, you know you're not living in alignment with what you actually believe. Now, here's a really important distinction Dr. Penn makes, because I think this is where a lot of people get boundaries wrong in practice. A boundary is not a punishment. A boundary is not an ultimatum. A boundary is not you trying to control someone else's behavior. A true boundary is simply a statement about what you will or will not do, or what you will or will not accept, and it lives entirely in your own court. Let me give you an example of the difference. Trying to control someone sounds like this. You need to stop calling me every night, or I'm going to be so angry at you. That's not really a boundary. That's a demand paired with a threat, and it puts the responsibility for your emotional state onto changing their behavior. A real boundary sounds more like this. I'm not available for calls after 9 p.m. If you call after that time, I won't pick up, but I'll call you back in the morning. See the difference? The second version isn't asking the other person to change who they are. It's simply stating what you personally will do. You're not trying to control their choice to call late. You're just being clear about your own choice not to answer. This distinction matters enormously because it takes boundaries out of the realm of conflict and puts them into the realm of clarity. You're not fighting the other person. You're just being honest about your own limits, and then honoring those limits yourself, regardless of what they do with that information. Dr. Penn spends a good amount of time on why boundaries so often trigger such strong reactions in other people, because I think understanding this helps you not take those reactions so personally. When you set a new boundary with someone who is used to you having none, you're changing the terms of a relationship that has been running on a certain unspoken agreement for a long time. And people, generally speaking, do not love it when the terms change, even if the old terms were unfair to you. He describes this using an idea borrowed from family systems, thinking the concept of homeostasis. Every relationship system, whether it's a marriage, a friendship, or a family, settles into a kind of equilibrium over time. Even if that equilibrium isn't healthy, it's familiar, and familiar feels safe to the human nervous system, even when it's actually harmful. So when you introduce a boundary, you're disrupting that equilibrium. And the system, meaning the people around you, will often, consciously or unconsciously, try to push back and restore the old arrangement. This is sometimes called an extinction burst in behavioral terms. Right before a behavior change actually sticks, the resistance to it often gets more intense, not less, because the old pattern is fighting for its survival. This is really important to understand, because it means that when you set a boundary and the other person reacts badly, gets upset, accuses you of changing, tries to guilt you back into the old pattern, that reaction is not proof that you did something wrong. It's actually often a sign that the boundary is working, that it's disrupting a dynamic that wasn't serving you. The discomfort you feel in that moment is the sound of an old, unhealthy equilibrium breaking apart to make room for a healthier one. Let's talk about guilt specifically for a moment, because I think this is the single biggest thing that stops people from setting boundaries in the first place. Dr. Penn makes an important distinction between guilt and what he calls the echo of guilt. Real guilt is a signal that you've done something that conflicts with your own values, something that actually harmed someone unfairly. That's useful information, and you should listen to it. But the echo of guilt is something else entirely. It's the leftover emotional residue of having been trained over years to associate other people's disappointment with your own wrongdoing, even when you haven't actually done anything wrong. The echo of guilt fires just as intensely as real guilt, which is why it's so convincing. But it's not actually pointing you toward anything true. It's just an old alarm going off out of habit. Here's a practical way to tell the difference. Ask yourself, if a friend I deeply respect did exactly what I just did, would I think they'd done something wrong? If a friend told you they said no to a request that would have exhausted them, would you judge them for it? Or would you think, good for them, that was healthy? If the answer is the latter, then what you're feeling isn't real guilt, it's the echo. And the echo doesn't need to be obeyed. It just needs to be acknowledged and allowed to pass through, the same way we talked about with anxious thoughts in our last deep dive. Dr. Penn gives a beautiful reframe here that I want to share directly, because I think it's one of the more powerful lines in this section. He says, guilt tells you that you did something wrong. Grief tells you that something is changing. A lot of what we call guilt when we set a boundary is actually grief. Grief for the version of the relationship where we were endlessly available, endlessly agreeable, endlessly self-sacrificing. That relationship is ending, and something new, hopefully more honest, is taking its place. It makes sense to feel something when that shift happens, but that feeling is grief for an old pattern, not proof that the new pattern is wrong. Let's talk about how to actually deliver a boundary, because the language matters quite a bit here. Dr. Penn recommends what he calls the three-part boundary statement. First, a brief acknowledgement of the other person's request or feeling, so they know they've been heard. Second, a clear, simple statement of your limit without a long list of justifications. Third, if relevant, an alternative or a note of care, so the boundary doesn't feel like a rejection of the entire relationship, just of this particular request. Here's an example. Imagine a friend constantly asks to vent to you late at night, and it's affecting your sleep and your own mental health. A three-part boundary might sound like this. I can hear that you're going through a really hard time right now, and I care about you. I'm not able to talk on the phone after 10 p.m. anymore because I need that time to rest. I'd love to catch up during the day this week if that works for you. Notice what's missing from that. There's no over-explaining. There's no apologizing 5 times. There's no long list of excuses trying to justify why you're allowed to have this boundary, as if you need to earn permission to have limits. Over-explaining is actually a subtle form of the approval trap sneaking back in, trying to get the other person to agree that your boundary is reasonable before you're allowed to have it. But you don't need their agreement. You just need your own clarity. One more thing Dr. Penn addresses here, because I think it's crucial. Setting a boundary does not guarantee the other person will respond well. Some people will respect it immediately. Some people will need time to adjust. And some people, unfortunately, will reveal something important about the relationship by how poorly they react. If someone responds to a reasonable, kindly stated boundary with rage, guilt-tripping, or an attempt to punish you into reversing it, that reaction is data. It's telling you something about whether that relationship was built on genuine mutual respect or on your willingness to have no limits at all. This doesn't mean every relationship that struggles with a new boundary is doomed. People can adjust, especially with patience and repetition. But it does mean you should pay attention to the pattern over time, rather than assuming the very first uncomfortable reaction means you did something wrong and should immediately retract the boundary. Before we move to the next section, I want to leave you with something Dr. Penn writes near the end of this chapter, because I think it reframes the whole concept beautifully. He says a boundary is not you loving someone else less. A boundary is you loving yourself enough to stay in the relationship without slowly disappearing inside it. The people who can genuinely handle your boundaries are the people who can actually handle the real you, not just the endlessly accommodating version of you they've gotten used to. And that real version of you, the one with limits, with preferences, with a clear sense of what you will and won't accept, is not a burden to the people who truly love you. It's the whole reason they love you in the first place. Part 3. The stories we build out of our pain. We've talked about approval, and we've talked about boundaries. Now I want to go somewhere a little deeper, into territory that Dr. Penn treats with real care in this book, because it touches on something almost everyone carries, which is pain from the past that hasn't just faded on its own. Here's the idea he opens with. He says human beings are meaning-making machines. We cannot simply experience something painful and leave it as raw, unprocessed data. Our minds immediately start building a story around it, an explanation for why it happened, what it means about us, what it means about the world, what it means about our future. This is actually an incredible cognitive gift most of the time. It's how we learn, how we adapt, how we avoid repeating mistakes. But it has a dark side, because the stories we build in the aftermath of pain are often built in a state of high emotional distress. And stories built in distress tend to be distorted, harsh, and disproportionately negative. And then they calcify. They harden into what feels like settled fact, even though they were only ever a first draft, written under the worst possible conditions. Let me give you an example. Say a child grows up with a parent who was emotionally distant, maybe not abusive exactly, just not very present, not very warm. That child's mind, doing exactly what minds do, builds a story to explain the distance. And because children are naturally egocentric in their thinking, not in a selfish way, but in a developmentally normal way, the story they tend to build is something like, my parent is distant because there's something wrong with me, something unlovable about me. It's a devastating story, but from a child's limited vantage point, it's often the most available explanation, because children don't yet have the capacity to understand that adults carry their own unresolved pain, their own limitations, their own reasons for behaving the way they do that have nothing to do with the child's worth. That story, formed at age 6 or 7, doesn't just stay in childhood. It often becomes the invisible architecture underneath an entire adult life. That same person, now 35, might find themselves desperately overworking to prove their worth, or avoiding intimacy because closeness feels dangerous, or chronically choosing emotionally unavailable partners without ever consciously connecting these patterns back to that early story. The story is running in the background, shaping decisions, and the person experiences it not as a story but as simply the truth about who they are. Dr. Penn's core intervention here, and I think it's genuinely one of the most useful ideas in this whole book, is what he calls narrative excavation. The idea is to go back and actually find the story, to pull it up from the background and look at it directly, because a story you can see is a story you can revise. A story that stays invisible, running silently underneath your behavior, cannot be revised. It just keeps steering the ship from below deck. Here's how this might work in practice. You notice a recurring pattern in your life. Maybe it's a pattern of choosing partners who don't fully show up for you. Instead of just judging yourself for the pattern or trying to will yourself into different choices through sheer effort, Dr. Penn suggests asking, when did I first learn that this is what love looks like? What early experience taught me that being loved means chasing someone who's just out of reach? Often, if you sit with that question honestly, a specific memory or a specific relationship surfaces. And once it surfaces, you can ask the next crucial question. Was the story I built back then actually true, or was it just the best explanation available to a child or to a person in crisis at the time? This is not about blaming your parents or blaming anyone for the rest of your life. Dr. Penn is very careful to distinguish between understanding the origin of a story and using that origin as an excuse to stay stuck. Understanding where a belief came from is not the same as deciding you're powerless to change it. In fact, it's the opposite. Understanding the origin often robs the belief of its disguise as objective truth and reveals it instead as what it actually always was: a story built by a person doing their best with limited information at a specific and difficult moment. Let's talk about a related concept Dr. Penn introduces, which he calls the difference between a wound and a scar. A wound is open, raw, still actively painful, still bleeding in some sense. A scar is the mark left behind after healing has occurred. It might still be visible. It might still be a little tender if you press directly on it. But it is not actively hurting you the way an open wound does. Dr. Penn argues that a lot of us are unconsciously treating old scars as if they were still open wounds, protecting them, guarding them, organizing our entire lives around, avoiding anything that might touch that old spot, when, in reality, the wound closed a long time ago. We just never got the memo because nobody ever went back to check. Part of narrative excavation, then, is going back to actually check. Is this still an open wound, something that requires ongoing protection and avoidance? Or is it a scar, something that happened, that mattered, that shaped you, but that you've actually already survived and integrated? A lot of people discover, once they actually look directly at an old pain rather than reflexively avoiding it, that it's far less dangerous to look at than they expected. The avoidance itself had become scarier than the memory. Now, here's where Dr. Penn takes this in a direction I found really moving. He talks about post-traumatic growth, which is a real, well-documented psychological phenomenon. It's the finding that a significant portion of people who go through genuinely difficult experiences, loss, illness, major setbacks, don't just recover to their previous baseline. Some of them actually end up with a deeper sense of meaning, stronger relationships, greater appreciation for life, and a clearer sense of their own priorities than they had before the difficult experience occurred. This is not to say that suffering is good, or that we should seek out pain, or that everyone experiences growth from hardship. Some experiences are simply losses, and framing every difficulty as secretly a gift can be its own kind of toxic positivity, minimizing real pain. But it does mean that difficulty is not automatically just damage. Sometimes, with the right conditions, it becomes the raw material for a kind of depth and wisdom that comfort alone never produces. Dr. Penn identifies a few conditions that seem to make post-traumatic growth more likely based on the research he cites. One is having a supportive community to process the experience with, rather than facing it in isolation. Another is being able to find some form of meaning or narrative coherence in what happened, some way of integrating it into your larger life story, rather than experiencing it as a senseless, disconnected wound. A third is taking some form of constructive action afterward, using the experience to help others, to change direction, to build something new, rather than simply enduring it passively. He tells the story of a man who lost his business in an economic downturn after 20 years of building it from scratch. For a long time, the man's story about this event was simple and brutal. I failed. I'm a failure. Everything I built was for nothing. But over time, through a lot of deliberate reflection, he began to revise that story, not by pretending the loss didn't hurt. It absolutely did, but by widening the frame. He began to see that the skills he'd built running that business, resilience, negotiation, and understanding of people, were not erased by its ending. He eventually used those skills to help other small business owners navigate their own crises, something he said he never would have had the credibility or empathy to do if he hadn't gone through the loss himself. The failure of the business became, in his revised story, not the end of his usefulness in the world, but the beginning of a different, in some ways more meaningful chapter. I want to be really careful here, because I don't want this to sound like I'm suggesting you need to find a silver lining in every painful thing that's ever happened to you, or that if you can't find meaning in your suffering, you're doing it wrong. That's not what Dr. Penn is saying, and it's not what I'm saying either. Some things are simply hard, and it's okay if the story is still being written, or if some chapters remain simply painful without a redemptive arc attached. The goal isn't to force meaning onto everything. The goal is to notice when you're carrying a story that was written in crisis, under distorted conditions, and to give yourself permission to look at it again with older, wiser eyes, and revise it if it no longer serves you or reflects the truth. Dr. Penn closes this section with an exercise he calls writing the second draft. He suggests taking one significant, painful story from your life, one you've told yourself for years, and literally writing it out twice. First, write it exactly the way you've always told it to yourself, with all the old judgments, the old conclusions about what it means about you. Then, write it a second time, as if you were a wise, compassionate biographer looking at the same events from the outside. Someone who has all the context, who understands you were doing your best with what you knew at the time, who can see the parts of the story that the original narrator, you in pain, could not see. Almost everyone who does this exercise finds that the second draft is not a lie, and it's not denial. It's simply more complete. It includes context the first draft left out. It includes compassion. The first draft was too wounded to offer. And often, that second draft is the truer one, not because the first draft contained false facts, but because it was missing an entire dimension of understanding that only becomes available with distance, with growth, and with the willingness to actually go back and look again. Part 4. Courage over comfort. Let's talk about courage, because I think this word gets thrown around so much that it's almost lost its meaning. We picture courage as something dramatic, running into a burning building, standing up to a tyrant, some singular, cinematic moment of bravery. But Dr. Penn wants us to see courage completely differently. He argues that the vast majority of courage required in an actual human life is quiet, undramatic, and almost invisible to anyone watching. It's the courage to have a difficult conversation you've been avoiding for 6 months. It's the courage to admit you were wrong in a meeting, in front of people whose respect you want. It's the courage to try something new in your 40s, when everyone around you has already settled into their identity, and you risk looking foolish by starting over. It's the courage to sit with an uncomfortable emotion instead of numbing it with your phone, or food, or work, or whatever your particular escape hatch happens to be. He introduces a really useful distinction here between comfort and safety. These get conflated all the time, but they're not the same thing. Safety is about actual risk to your well-being, physical or otherwise. Comfort is simply about familiarity, about the absence of an uneasy feeling. And here's the problem. Our nervous systems, again going back to that old evolutionary wiring, often treat the two as if they're identical when they're not. Something can be completely safe and still feel deeply uncomfortable, precisely because it's unfamiliar. Public speaking is a great example. It's not actually dangerous in any physical sense for most people, but the discomfort it produces can feel physiologically almost identical to genuine danger. Racing heart, sweaty palms, that flight instinct kicking in. Because of this confusion, we often make decisions based on avoiding discomfort as if we were avoiding danger, when in reality we're just avoiding an unfamiliar feeling that has no actual power to hurt us. Dr. Penn calls this the comfort trap, and he argues it's one of the primary forces that keeps people stuck in lives, jobs, and relationships that no longer fit them, long after they've quietly known, somewhere inside, that it's time to change. Let's talk about why the comfort trap is so sticky. Part of it is something behavioral scientists call loss aversion, which is the finding that human beings feel the pain of losing something roughly twice as intensely as we feel the pleasure of gaining something equivalent. This means that even a bad, unfulfilling situation, because it's known, because it's already yours, feels safer to protect than an unknown. Potentially better situation feels attractive to pursue. We will often choose a mediocre certainty over a promising uncertainty. purely because of how our brains weigh loss against gain. Dr. Penn illustrates this with the story of a woman who stayed in a job she found soul-crushing for nearly a decade. She wasn't unaware of her unhappiness. She could articulate it clearly whenever asked. But every time she got close to actually applying elsewhere or exploring a different path, a wave of anxiety would hit, and she'd retreat back to the familiar discomfort of her current job, because at least that discomfort was known, predictable, survivable. The unknown discomfort of a job search, of possible rejection, of starting over, felt, to her nervous system, more dangerous, even though objectively it very likely wasn't. The work, Dr. Penn says, is learning to recognize this pattern as it's happening and to develop what he calls discomfort tolerance, which is really just the capacity to feel uncomfortable without immediately needing to escape the feeling. This is a trainable skill, not a fixed trait some people have and others don't. Just like a muscle, your capacity to sit with discomfort grows through repeated, manageable exposure to it. He suggests starting small, deliberately, with what he calls courage reps. These are tiny, low-stakes acts of doing the uncomfortable thing on purpose, specifically to build the muscle. Sending the text you've been avoiding, asking the question in the meeting that feels slightly embarrassing to ask, ordering something different at the restaurant instead of your usual safe choice. These sound almost silly in isolation, but the point isn't the specific action. The point is training your nervous system to have the experience of feeling uncomfortable, taking the action anyway, and then discovering over and over that you survived it, and often that it went better than you feared. Each rep makes the next slightly bigger act of courage a little more accessible, because you're building actual evidence stored in your body, not just your intellect. That discomfort is survivable and often worthwhile. There's a really important idea Dr. Penn introduces here about the relationship between courage and fear, because I think a lot of people have a subtly wrong model of how this works. Many of us believe that courageous people simply feel less fear than everyone else, that somewhere out there are these naturally brave individuals who just don't experience the same anxious jolt the rest of us do when facing something hard. Dr. Penn pushes back on this pretty firmly. He says, courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is fear plus action anyway. In fact, he argues that people who take significant risks, who have significant courage in their lives, often report experiencing just as much fear as anyone else. What's different isn't the intensity of the fear. What's different is their relationship to it. They've learned that the fear is not a stop sign. It's simply a sensation that shows up when you're doing something that matters, and it doesn't get final say over your actions. He offers a reframe I really like here. Instead of waiting to feel confident before you act, which often means waiting forever, since confidence is usually built by acting, not before it, he suggests treating fear itself as a kind of compass. If something scares you specifically because it matters to you, because you actually care about the outcome, that fear might be pointing you directly towards something meaningful rather than away from it. Not all fear works this way, of course. Fear of genuine danger is different from fear of meaningful risk. But a lot of the fear that keeps us stuck in comfortable, unfulfilling patterns isn't protecting us from danger at all. It's just protecting us from the vulnerability of caring about something enough that failure would actually hurt. Let's talk about failure specifically for a moment, because the fear of it underlies so much of our avoidance of courageous action. Dr. Penn brings back a concept from our last deep dive, the idea of action over outcome, and applies it here in a new way. He argues that our culture has trained us to see failure as a permanent verdict on our worth, rather than as simply information gathered through an attempt. But if you look at literally anyone who has built something meaningful, a career, a relationship, a body of creative work, their path is never a straight line of unbroken success. It's a long, messy sequence of attempts, some of which didn't work, mixed in with the ones that did. The people who eventually succeed are very rarely the people who failed the least. They're the people who kept making attempts after failing, who treated each failure as data rather than as a verdict. He tells a story about a novelist who had her first 3 manuscripts rejected by dozens of publishers over almost a decade. Each rejection could have been read as proof that she wasn't good enough, that she should give up, that her dream was foolish. Instead, she developed a practice of reading each rejection letter once, allowing herself to feel disappointed for exactly 1 day, and then extracting whatever useful feedback she could find before starting her next project. Her 4th manuscript eventually found a publisher and went on to real success. But she said something in an interview that Dr. Penn quotes, and it stuck with me. She said the 3 failed manuscripts weren't wasted years. They were the tuition I paid to become the writer capable of producing the 4th one. Nobody becomes excellent at something without paying that tuition in some form. I think this reframe, failure as tuition rather than as verdict, is one of the most liberating shifts you can make, because it takes the crushing finality out of setbacks. A failed attempt stops being evidence that you should stop trying, and starts being simply the price of admission for eventually getting somewhere we're going. Dr. Penn closes this section talking about what he calls the deathbed test, an exercise he borrows and adapts from a few other thinkers but applies specifically to courage. He suggests imagining yourself very old, at the actual end of your life, looking back. He asks, in that moment, are you more likely to regret the risks you took that didn't work out, or the risks you never took at all because the fear felt too big? For the overwhelming majority of people who genuinely sit with this question honestly, the answer isn't close. We very rarely regret the courageous swing that missed. We deeply regret the swing we never took, the conversation we never had, the path we never explored, because those regrets don't fade with time the way disappointment over an honest attempt does. They just quietly compound, becoming a kind of low, persistent ache about a life not fully lived. Courage, in the end, isn't about being fearless. It's about deciding, again and again, in small moments and occasionally large ones, that the discomfort of trying is more bearable than the quiet grief of never having tried at all. Part 5. Gratitude without the toxicity. Let's talk about gratitude, because I think this is a word that's been so overused, so plastered onto inspirational graphics with sunsets in the background, that it started to feel almost meaningless, or worse, like a subtle form of pressure to feel a certain way when you're actually struggling. Dr. Penn opens this section by acknowledging that criticism directly. He says gratitude has been hijacked by what he calls toxic positivity, the demand that we feel grateful and cheerful regardless of our actual circumstances, as if negative emotions are simply a failure to practice enough gratitude. He wants to completely separate real gratitude from this shallow, forced imitation of it. Real gratitude, he argues, is not about pretending everything is fine. It's not about suppressing pain, disappointment, or grief. It's not a bypass around difficult emotions. In fact, forced gratitude, the kind where you berate yourself for feeling sad by reminding yourself that others have it worse, is actually psychologically harmful. It teaches you to distrust your own emotional experience, to override genuine feelings with a performance of positivity that doesn't actually address what's happening inside you. So what is real gratitude, then? Dr. Penn describes it as an expanded field of attention. Here's what he means by that. Our attention, left unmanaged, has a strong natural bias toward threats, problems, and things that are missing. This made evolutionary sense. Noticing the one thing that could kill you was more important, survival-wise, than noticing the 100 things that were fine. But in a modern life where most of us are not facing constant physical danger, this threat-scanning bias just becomes a kind of chronic dissatisfaction engine. We notice what's wrong, what's missing, what could be better, far more readily than we notice what's already good, already working, already present. Gratitude, properly understood, is simply the deliberate practice of widening your attention to include the things that are actually going well, that are actually present, alongside your awareness of what's difficult. It's not replacing the difficulty. It's adding to the picture what the threat-scanning bias naturally leaves out. Dr. Penn makes an important distinction between what he calls comparative gratitude and direct gratitude. Comparative gratitude is the kind where you feel grateful because you're comparing your situation to someone worse off. At least I'm not like them. This kind of gratitude is fragile and, frankly, a little unkind because it requires someone else's suffering as the measuring stick for your own contentment. Direct gratitude, by contrast, doesn't need a comparison at all. It's simply noticing something good in itself without needing anyone else to be worse off in order to appreciate it. The warmth of sunlight through a window, the specific way a friend laughs, the fact that your body, imperfect as it may be, got you through another day. Direct gratitude is more stable and more genuinely nourishing because it doesn't depend on maintaining a mental hierarchy of whose suffering counts more. He also introduces the idea of gratitude as a practice rather than a feeling, which I think is a really useful reframe. A lot of people wait to feel grateful before they express or acknowledge gratitude, as if gratitude only counts when it arrives spontaneously. But Dr. Penn argues, drawing on research into behavioral psychology, that the practice often precedes the feeling, not the other way around. You write down 3 specific things at the end of the day, even when you don't particularly feel like it, even on a hard day. And the feeling of gratitude often follows the practice, rather than the practice waiting patiently for the feeling to show up first. This matters especially on genuinely difficult days, the days when gratitude feels almost insulting to suggest. Dr. Penn is careful here. He's not suggesting you force yourself to feel grateful for the hard thing itself. If you lost a job, he's not asking you to be grateful for the job loss. What he's suggesting is that even inside a genuinely hard day, there are almost always small, real, true things that are not part of the hard thing. The coffee that tasted good this morning, a message from a friend checking in, the fact that you got out of bed despite everything. Acknowledging these small, true things doesn't erase or minimize the hard things sitting alongside them. It just refuses to let the hard thing take up the entirety of your attention when it doesn't actually occupy the entirety of your reality. Let's talk about a specific practice Dr. Penn recommends, which he calls the specificity rule. He argues that vague gratitude, the kind that says simply, "I'm grateful for my family," or "I'm grateful for my health," doesn't actually produce much of a psychological effect because it's too general to really land. The brain processes vague statements almost automatically, without much emotional engagement. Specific gratitude works very differently. Instead of "I'm grateful for my friend," try, "I'm grateful that my friend remembered I had a hard meeting today and texted to check how it went." The specificity forces your mind to actually revisit the moment, to relive it briefly. And that reliving is where the emotional and even physiological benefits of gratitude actually occur. Research on this, which Dr. Penn cites, has found measurable effects on mood and even on physical markers of stress from consistent, specific gratitude practice. Effects that vague, generic gratitude simply doesn't produce to the same degree. There's another dimension to this chapter that I found particularly moving, which is gratitude directed at yourself, rather than only at your external circumstances or other people. Most of us are far more comfortable expressing gratitude toward others or toward our circumstances than we are acknowledging anything we ourselves have done well. This connects back to what we discussed in our previous deep dive about the inner critic, but Dr. Penn takes it a step further here. He suggests a specific practice of ending each day by acknowledging one thing you did that took some form of effort or courage, no matter how small, and simply thanking yourself for it. Not in a self-congratulatory, arrogant way, but in the same sincere, specific way you'd thank a friend who did something kind for you. He argues that this practice, self-directed gratitude, is one of the most underused tools for building the kind of sovereign, unshakable sense of self we've been talking about throughout this whole book. Because when your sense of appreciation is only ever pointed outward, at other people, at circumstances, you never build the internal reservoir of recognizing your own effort, your own resilience, your own quiet daily acts of showing up. And that internal reservoir turns out to be one of the most stable foundations available for genuine self-respect, far more stable than achievement, than approval, than any external validation, because it doesn't depend on anyone else noticing. It only requires you to notice. Before we move into our final section, Dr. Penn offers a lovely image that I want to share. He compares genuine gratitude to a lighthouse rather than a spotlight. A spotlight, he says, is what toxic positivity offers. It insists on shining only on the bright, cheerful parts of a scene, forcibly illuminating positivity while leaving everything difficult in darkness, pretending the darkness simply isn't there. A lighthouse works completely differently. A lighthouse doesn't pretend the dark, stormy sea doesn't exist. In fact, it exists specifically because of the storm, to help guide ships safely through difficult waters. It doesn't deny the difficulty of the sea. It simply offers a steady point of light within it. Real gratitude, Dr. Penn argues, functions like that lighthouse. It doesn't deny the storm you might be navigating. It simply offers a steady point of light within it, something true and good to orient toward, even while the difficult parts of your reality remain fully acknowledged. Part 6. The discipline of presence. We've covered a lot of ground. Approval, boundaries, the stories we tell ourselves, courage, gratitude. Now I want to bring us to something that ties almost everything else together, which Dr. Penn calls the discipline of presence. He opens with an observation that struck me quite a bit. He says most of human unhappiness isn't actually caused by our circumstances directly. It's caused by the gap between where our attention is and where our body actually is. Think about the last time you were physically at dinner with someone you care about, but mentally replaying an argument from earlier, or drafting an email in your head, or worrying about tomorrow. Your body was present. Your mind was somewhere else entirely. And in that gap, that split, is where a huge amount of our quiet, persistent dissatisfaction actually lives. This isn't a new idea exactly. Mindfulness traditions have pointed at some version of this for thousands of years, but Dr. Penn frames it in a way that I think is genuinely useful for a modern, distraction-saturated life. He calls presence a discipline rather than a feeling, because, like most disciplines, it doesn't arrive automatically. It has to be practiced, deliberately, against the grain of a world that is very aggressively engineered to fragment your attention at every possible turn. Let's talk about why presence has become so difficult in the modern world specifically, because I think this context matters. Dr. Penn describes what he calls the attention economy, the entire ecosystem of apps, notifications, algorithms, and platforms whose business model literally depends on capturing and holding as much of your attention as possible, for as long as possible, as often as possible. These systems are not neutral. They are designed by extremely well-resourced teams of engineers and behavioral scientists to be as compelling, as difficult to look away from, as technically possible. Fighting for your own presence in this environment isn't just a matter of willpower. It's fighting against systems specifically engineered to defeat exactly that willpower. Understanding this, Dr. Penn argues, should actually make you feel less ashamed about how hard presence feels, and more clear-eyed about the fact that you're not fighting a personal weakness. You're fighting a very sophisticated, very well-funded opponent, and it makes sense that the fight requires real, deliberate structure, not just good intentions. He introduces the concept of attention residue, borrowed from research on cognitive switching. This is the finding that when you switch from one task or one form of attention to another, whether that's checking your phone during a conversation or jumping between browser tabs while working, part of your cognitive resources remains stuck on the previous task for some time afterward, even after you've moved on. This means that constant task switching doesn't just cost you the time of switching itself. It leaves a lingering fog across everything you do afterward, a kind of attentional static that degrades the quality of your engagement with whatever comes next. This has huge implications for how we experience our relationships, our work, and honestly, our own inner life. If you're constantly switching your attention, checking your phone mid-conversation, Thinking about work while you're supposed to be relaxing, thinking about relaxing while you're supposed to be working, you're never actually getting the full benefit of anything, because a residue of the previous thing is always contaminating your experience of the current thing. Dr. Penn suggests a practice he calls the container method, which I found genuinely useful. Instead of trying to be constantly present across your entire day, which is unrealistic and sets you up for a sense of failure, he suggests building specific containers, meaning clearly defined blocks of time and attention dedicated to one thing at a time, with clear beginnings and endings. A container for focused work with your phone in another room. A container for a meal with someone you care about, phone away, no other input competing for your attention. A container for genuine rest, distinct from the scrolling that often masquerades as rest but actually leaves you more depleted than before. The key insight here is that containers work because they have edges. Without a clear boundary around a period of attention, our minds default to a kind of low-grade, always partial presence, always slightly split between the thing in front of us and the dozen other things pulling at our awareness. A container with a defined start and end gives your mind permission to fully arrive somewhere, because it knows there's a clear boundary, an end point, rather than an indefinite, boundaryless stretch of divided attention. Let's talk about presence in relationships specifically, because I think this is where the cost of its absence is felt most acutely. Dr. Penn describes something he calls the half-listening trap. This is when, during a conversation, instead of actually absorbing what the other person is saying, part of your mind is already formulating your response, or evaluating whether you agree, or waiting for a pause so you can share your own related story. This happens so automatically, so habitually, that most people don't even notice they're doing it. But the person on the other end of the conversation often can feel it, even if they can't quite articulate what's missing. There's a subtle but real difference in the quality of being listened to versus being half listened to while someone waits for their turn to speak. He offers a practice here called reflective listening, not as a rigid therapeutic technique to deploy in every conversation, which would feel stilted and strange, but as an occasional deliberate practice to rebuild the muscle of actually absorbing what someone says before formulating your own response. The practice is simple. Before responding to something meaningful someone shares with you, briefly reflect back what you heard in your own words before adding your own thoughts. This does two things. First, it ensures you actually understood correctly, rather than responding to your own assumption about what they meant. Second, and maybe more importantly, it forces you to actually listen fully, because you know you'll need to reflect it back, which prevents your mind from drifting into formulating your response prematurely. Dr. Penn also spends time on presence with yourself, which I think is an underexplored dimension of this whole topic. He argues that many of us are just as absent from our own internal experience as we are from the people around us. We rush past our own emotions, distract ourselves from our own physical sensations, override our own needs in favor of the next task on the list. Presence with yourself means periodically checking in, actually asking, what am I feeling right now, in my body, not just in my thoughts? What do I actually need in this moment? These questions sound simple, almost obvious, but most of us go entire days, sometimes entire weeks, without genuinely asking them, running instead on a kind of autopilot that keeps us productive but disconnected from our own inner landscape. He closes this section with a practice he calls the arrival breath. It's deceptively simple. Before transitioning into any new context, a meeting, a conversation, time with your family, he suggests taking one single conscious breath and using that breath as a kind of threshold, a deliberate moment of leaving whatever came before fully behind and arriving completely in what's happening now. It sounds almost too small to matter, but Dr. Penn argues that these tiny thresholds, repeated consistently throughout a day, accumulate into something significant over time. They're small acts of choosing presence over and over in the exact moments when the pull toward fragmentation is strongest. presence, in the end, is not a permanent state you achieve once and maintain forever without effort. It's a discipline you return to, breath by breath, container by container, conversation by conversation, in a world that is constantly, systematically pulling your attention in a dozen directions at once. And every single time you choose to actually arrive fully in the moment you're already in, you're not just improving your experience of that particular moment. You're building the underlying capacity for a life that feels like it's actually being lived rather than merely being rushed through. Part 7. The quiet architecture of a life well lived. We're coming to the close of our journey today, and I want to use this final section to pull everything together. Because Dr. Penn does something beautiful in his conclusion that I think deserves real attention. He starts by asking a question that I want you to actually sit with, not just read past. If your life were a house and every choice you made were a brick, what would the current structure look like? Would it be something you're proud to live inside? Would it have room for the people you love? Would it be built on a foundation you actually chose, or one that was handed to you by other people's expectations, poured before you were even old enough to have a say in it? This is what Dr. Penn calls the quiet architecture of a life, the accumulated result of thousands of small, largely unnoticed choices made day after day that eventually add up to the shape of an entire existence. And here's the thing he wants us to really absorb. Nobody builds a life they're unhappy with in one single, dramatic decision. It happens brick by brick, through 1,000 small moments of choosing the approval trap over authenticity, choosing the absence of boundaries over self-respect, choosing an old, distorted story over an honest revision, choosing comfort over courage, choosing distraction over presence. None of these choices, in isolation, feels significant, but compounded over years, they build the entire structure of a life. The reassuring flip side of this is that the same principle works in the opposite direction. You don't need one grand, dramatic transformation to build a different kind of life. You need 1,000 small choices, made consistently in the direction of sovereignty rather than reactivity. Every time you choose your own internal compass over the noise of the approval trap, that's a brick. Every time you set a boundary instead of silently absorbing resentment, that's a brick. Every time you revise an old, distorted story with a more honest, compassionate second draft, that's a brick. Every time you choose the discomfort of courage over the false safety of staying stuck, that's a brick. Every time you widen your attention to include what's actually good alongside what's difficult, that's a brick. Every time you choose to actually arrive, fully present, in the moment you're already in, that's a brick. None of these individual choices will feel like they're transforming your entire life in the moment you make them. That's actually the whole point, and also, in a strange way, the whole difficulty. We want transformation to feel dramatic, to arrive with some clear, unmistakable sense of significance. But real, durable transformation almost never works that way. It works through accumulation, through the quiet, unglamorous repetition of small aligned choices, until one day you look up, months or years later, and realize the entire structure of your life has shifted, brick by brick, without a single moment along the way that felt like the moment everything changed. Dr. Penn offers a final reflection that I want to leave you with, because I think it captures the entire spirit of everything we've explored today. He writes that sovereignty is not the absence of other people's opinions, the absence of fear, the absence of old wounds, or the absence of distraction. Sovereignty is simply the quiet, ongoing practice of returning, again and again, to your own honest center, even after you've been pulled away from it, which you will be, repeatedly, because that's simply what it means to be a person living in a complicated world full of other people, old patterns, and endless demands on your attention. The goal was never to become someone who is never pulled away. The goal is to become someone who knows how to find their way back. So here's what I want you to do with everything we've covered today. Don't try to implement all 7 of these ideas simultaneously starting tomorrow morning. That's a recipe for overwhelm, and overwhelm is just another way of ending up right back in the approval trap, this time chasing the approval of some imagined perfect version of yourself instead of other people. Instead, pick one idea that landed most strongly for you today. Maybe it's the disapproval rehearsal practice. Maybe it's the 3-part boundary statement. Maybe it's writing the second draft of an old, painful story. Maybe it's a single courage rep this week. Pick one and just practice that one thing deliberately for the next several days. Let it become slightly more natural before you add the next one. This is a long game. It always was. But every single brick you lay in the direction of a sovereign, unshakable sense of self is a brick that stays, one that no amount of criticism, comparison, or difficult circumstance can fully take away from you, because it was never built by anyone else's hands in the first place. It was built by yours. Thank you for spending these 2 hours with me today. Thank you for being willing to look honestly at the architecture of your own life. That kind of honesty is not always comfortable, but it is, without question, worth it. Until next time, take care of that quiet, sovereign mind of yours. It's the only home you'll ever actually live inside.